Good morning, bishops, members of the clergy, religious men and women, faith-filled men and women of the church. It is my pleasure today to introduce you today our keynote presenter, Father Ron Rolheiser. I have known Ron for over 30 years as a friend, a mentor, and fellow oblate, as because of Ron, I became an associate of the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate 23 years ago. The presentation, or the introduction of Ron in the booklet, covers where his ministry journey has taken and many of his accomplishments. 3 words, though, I would like to use to present Ron to you today. The first is missionary. Often when we think of missionaries, we think of someone who goes somewhere else, goes to another country. Ron has been a missionary in our midst. Someone inviting us also to be missionary disciples in our midst, calling us to be missionaries to our children, to our families, to our friends, to our co-workers. The second word I'd like to use to describe Ron in his ministry journey is prophet, in the biblical sense of the word, reading the signs of the times to us. And through his books, his column, his keynote addresses and lectures, pointing out to us what is happening around us in our midst, calling us to heed and to act, to be those missionaries that we are called to be from our baptism. And the third word that I would like to use to describe Ron is a man from the prairies. It's not happened to me before, but since I've been here, many people have come up to me, seen that I'm from the Diocese of Prince Albert, and said, "You're a prairie girl." I don't usually think of myself as a prairie girl, but I was called a prairie girl, and proud of it, because I've had conversations with Ron about prairie spirituality and what that means. And Ron is a man from the prairies, and encompasses that. And there's 3 words from there that I want to pull out. Straightforward. Ron is a plain speaker in many ways. He crafts his words, and they are beautiful, and they invite us in. But it is plain language, clear, if we would only listen and heed, calling us, as I've said, to be missionaries in our society. Kindness, compassion, and hope are also characteristics of the prairies. Maybe the coldness, we have to be reaching out and helping each other all the time. And Ron, in his articles on suicide that he writes annually, I have heard so many people who have experienced that dreadful disease within their family touched and embraced by his words. And hardworking. Ron has been a prolific writer, lecturer, keynote. One of the best compliments I've ever gotten from Father Doug, he said, "Christine, you work as hard as Father Ron and Father Jerry." So I felt pretty good that day. So please join me in welcoming Father Ron Rolheiser, Missionary Oblate of Mary Immaculate, our keynote presenter today.
Whoops. It's good to see you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. How's the sound? You can all hear? Okay. Because this thing doesn't tilt. Anyway, it's good to be home. I'm a Canadian. I've been living in the United States for 14 years, but I consider myself in exile. Okay. And when I'm in Ontario, I'm in exile from Saskatchewan. Okay. Anyways, I was happy. I got here last night just in time to catch Josephine's presentation. I think it set a wonderful tone for this. I want to begin before my presentation with just two stories that irreverent stories maybe set a tone for catechesis and evangelization today. The first one, a Filipino friend. He grew up in the Philippines, and he said, we were quite poor, and he said, I always wanted a bicycle, and my parents couldn't afford it. He said, so I told everybody I'm going to pray that God gives me a bicycle. He said, and people laughed at me. He said, that's not the way God works. You know, God isn't some puppet on a string. You pray and you get a bicycle. He said, so I stole the bicycle and went to confession. He said, apparently that's the way God works. Okay. second contemporary story. So there's a grandfather, and he's lamenting to his grandkids. He said, how the world today, it's everything. It's all iPhones and everything. He said, I'm lost in this new world. He said, when I was a kid, he said, I could go to the corner store, I'd have $1 in my pocket. He said, and I could come back from the store, he said, I'd have a Coca-Cola, a chocolate bar, 3 packs of gum, and a bag of chips. He said, today you can't do that anymore. He said, they have cameras everywhere. Okay. Anyway, the topic. From the well to the world, evangelization and catechesis. And if I can get my people to move the first slide there. I want to do 3 things with you, or 4 things during the 2 sessions. I want to talk about this morning about the issue of our world, the consequences, and I want to give you just some I call them metaphors to digest, taken from all over the place. Then this afternoon I want to talk about moving forward. How do we move forward in catechesis and evangelization? Okay, if you can, next slide. The issue. Okay. I want to start with 2 quotes from Karl Rahner and from David Tracy. Karl Rahner says, never take for granted that everyone alive at the same time belongs to the same generation. That's far-reaching. Today so often we say, well, our world needs this, or our kids need that, and so on. It's always partly true and partly not true, because there isn't one kind of kid, there isn't one kind of person, there isn't one kind of world. We live in a world, we call ourselves the postmodern world. We're only partly postmodern. There's also a lot of modernity, there's also a lot of anti-modernity. In our world, there's some pre-modernity. And so, for instance, just really practically, if you're preaching a homily in Canada, take for granted that there's at least 2.5 different generations inside that church. Okay. David Tracy just teases it out. He said, we're living in a time when 4 different generations are all meeting within the same generation. He said, we're a mixture of pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and anti-modern, all sharing a single generation. Okay, that's just for flavor. I want to look at what are we looking at when we talk about catechesis and evangelization? What are the issues? Now, some of this is going to be a little obvious, but I want to do an exercise here in naming, okay? First of all, our emptying and graying churches. We can be fooled today because a lot of times our churches are still pretty full, but don't be so fooled by that. I live in the Archdiocese of San Antonio right now, and last October they did every October they count heads going to churches. And we have in San Antonio right now, which is a pretty Catholic community, we have 150,000 Catholics who go to Mass every Sunday. But that's out of a Catholic population of 1.5 million. It's a simple math. That's about 10%, who practice regularly. And yet you can be fooled because our churches we're building bigger churches, And also the graying factor. We run a continued education program at our school, and during the course of a year, we put through about 3,000 people. That's wonderful, except we keep demographics, less than 10% are under 50. And I speak around the country, I speak different places. Usually a demographic crowd looks a little like this one, usually even a little bit older. Okay. And so that if you have 100 people, if you have 10 who are under 50, that's a young crowd. So that, just think about that, Most people who come out to these kinds of events are over 50 years old. So we're losing people, but we're also an aging crowd. I went back to Edmonton. I did my first about 12 years of ministry in Edmonton. And I started there in the mid-70s. And it was a very young city, young Catholic. And you'd go to the Chrism Mass. The cathedral was packed and wonderful. I went back a couple of years ago. The cathedral was packed and wonderful. The same people. We're all just 35 years older. Okay. Then, the growing marginalization of the churches in the mainstream culture. So it's the church is also losing huge traction in terms of its influence in the culture, politically, socially, and so on. So that we're being ever more marginalized, okay? And then the third one, is simply the reluctance of so many of our own to walk the path of explicit faith with us. See, so I suspect there isn't anybody in this room who hasn't got a child, a nephew, a niece, a relative, maybe a spouse, maybe a parent who no longer goes to church. So notice, say, the path of explicit faith, I'm not so pessimistic about our young, because, it's interesting, the statistic where they say, I don't know what it is for Canada, but in the United States, it's about 23% of people who call themselves none, religion, none, and so on. But when you ask them why, they'll invariably give you this kind of answer. They say, I just don't believe it anymore. So what's it? Well, it's the church and the God that they've heard about. That's not necessarily the church or the God that's real. They're rejecting something, or they're moving away from something in indifference. They say, I don't believe it. Well, sometimes what they don't believe is a good thing not to believe, because it's not the real God, it's not the real church, and so on. So there's still a fair amount of faith around. I don't think we're so post-Christian, as we'll talk about, but we are certainly post-ecclesial. When people use the word, we're post-Christian. No. In the West, we're post-ecclesial, And you get that in that famous expression, bad expression, but it's all over. I'm spiritual but not religious, Well, that means I still believe in God. I just don't believe in any of the social things around God and the church. Okay, next slide. Okay. A popular culture given over to anti-ecclesial and anti-clerical attitudes exacerbated by the clerical sexual abuse crisis. So the sexual abuse crisis, incidentally, I'm living in the United States right now. It's really bad right now. Since the Pennsylvania report last July, the poor bishops down there, that's all they're dealing with right now, and so on. But that's not the major factor. It plays into. We're in a culture that's reacting against itself. As I'll talk about later on when I talk about Kathleen Norris and Louis Dupree, they say that the culture is going through a certain adolescent grandiosity about its origins, which are Christian, And then the sexual abuse crisis simply plays into that. But there's a clear, anti-ecclesial, anti-clericalism that's inside of our culture. I'll give you a simple example. When I was teaching in Edmonton, I taught some extension stuff for the University of Alberta. This was in the 70s, early 80s. And at that time, they had a pretty good religious studies department at the University of Alberta, okay? But at that time, you could teach a course on anything except Christ. You could teach a course on, Buddhism, the eschatology of somebody, and so on. But you couldn't talk about Jesus because that would be parochial. Well, we measure time by his life, but otherwise he's not very important. But see, the people didn't recognize this. See, that's anti-ecclesial, it's anti-clerical. It's right side of the culture, Then the pathological individualism in our culture. In fact, to my mind, maybe that's the biggest culprit of all. Okay. When sociology of religion, and you have a very good one in Canada, Reginald Bibby, but when sociology of religion, when they study this and parse it out, they say, why aren't people going to church? Why are parishes working and so on? Usually we argue liberal and conservative. We've gone too far, we haven't gone far enough. And they'll say it's neither the two, They say it's the individuality in our culture. The original Bibby likes to say, he said, something? He said, notice, people are treating their churches in exactly the same way as they're treating their families, which means they want them around, but not much. Okay. So you want your family for some weddings, some funerals, but not on a weekly basis, We are, I'm going to give you a philosophical thing here. We are what I call the adult children of René Descartes. You can be an adult child of an alcoholic. We're the adult children of René Descartes. I'll give you an example. When I was working in Edmonton, I used to work with one of the parishes on a marriage course. So every Monday night, young people would come down taking this course to get married. They didn't want to take the course. It's one of those things, if you don't take the course, you can't get married, So I'd give a talk on marriage every third Monday, give a 45-minute talk. Any questions? The first question was always this: why do we have to take this course? And then they'd say this, something to this effect, say, why do we have to take this course? Why is the parish, why are my parents, why is the church trying to control my life? This is my life. This is skin off my teeth if it doesn't work. That has nothing to do with you. Whose voice is that? René Descartes. Remember René Descartes, who really is in many ways one of the founders of modernism. And he reversed kind of the way philosophy and thinking was done. He began with this first thing. He said, I think, therefore I am. So René Descartes says, what's the only thing you can be sure of? That you are. You're inside of yourself. In fact, you may be dreaming everything. You might even be God, as far as you know. The only thing is you exist. But see, today, my problems are real. My heartaches are real. This is my marriage. It's going to be my mortgage. It's going to be my kids, and so on. That's new. That's new in history. And it's partly unique even to Western culture, and so on. And so that, parishes and ecclesiology is constitutively social. That Christianity is something you do with other people. When someone says, I can be a good Christian, I can pray just as well at home, you absolutely can't. You can be a good Buddhist, you can be a good Hindu, you can be a good Taoist, you can be a good Muslim. You can't be a Christian or a Jew and pray just as well at home. Our religion is constitutively social. It's something we do with others. The French philosopher Charles Péguy, it's a beautiful line. He said, when you die and become before St. Peter, he said, you know what he's going to ask you? Peter's going to ask you this. He's going to say, and Peter speaks French. So Peter's going to say, où sont les autres? Where are the others? We're not walking here alone. Où sont les autres? Okay. Now, lastly, we live in a church divided. Okay. So that's still on the sheet. Okay. So we live with incredible internal tensions. And I want to tease these out because I think they're really important. And I want to tease them out using biblical images. So I said we live at an internal tension between the son of David and Adonai. I want to use a biblical story for this. It's a great story, in terms of evangelization today. And so last night with this beautiful Jesus dealing with the Samaritan woman. This is Jesus dealing with the Syrophoenician woman on the borders of Samaria. So you have this text in Matthew, you have it in Mark. And it says this. They say, one day Jesus was walking along the borders of Samaria. Full stop. And he meets a woman. Okay? Now, in the New Testament, a lot of times geography means more than geography. Borders is the edges of something. What? It was at the edges of a new ethnicity, different religion, and a different gender. Someone said to me, give me one line of where is the Christian church standing today? We're standing on new borders of ethnicity, religion, and gender, as we once knew them. And if ISIS hasn't woken us up yet to the fact we're not going to be woken up, it's going to be critically important for the church for the next 50 years. Islam, whether we want it or not. It's going to be critically important for the church in the next 50 years. Women, whether we want it or not. And so on. But anyway, that's not the part I'm getting to. Okay. Then he has this incredible conversation. This woman, who's a Syrophoenician. It's not so important particular ethnicity, but that she's not a Jew. He's a Jew. She comes up to Jesus and she says, Jesus, son of David, his Jewish title, Messiah. Jesus, son of David, be merciful to me and heal my daughter who's very sick. And then one of the more curious lines, don't try this pastorally, Jesus says to her, no. He says, I've been sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And it's not fair to give the food of the children to the house dogs. That's a nice pastor line for you, I'm just working with Roman Catholics. I don't deal with you, But then she doesn't react and say, well, there's going to be a lawsuit about this. Wait till the Me Too movement finds out. No. She's resilient. She says, yes, Lord Adonai. Notice she changes his title. Says, but even the children eat the bread that falls from from the table. Okay, the dogs, however that works. Okay, got it. Okay. Then Jesus does a 180-degree verse. Says, "Wow!" He said, "In all of Israel, I never saw faith like yours," and he gives you the miracle. Now, what happened there? Okay, I want to try to extrapolate that. Imagine this. Imagine you're working in an RCIA program, and you've just worked with these people through I shouldn't say program, process. Okay, and now you've worked with these 15 people. It's Holy Saturday, and it's just before the vigil, and you're putting water into the baptismal tub, and they've been on retreat all day, and you're all excited. And some woman you've never seen comes up and says to you, "Do you run the RCA program here?" And you say, "Well, yeah, I do." She says, "Could I be baptized tonight?" I don't like her chances. Okay. No, you'd answer like Jesus, say, "No, you can't. Like, it's not fair. These people did all this preparation. You just can't walk in here." That's the woman. She comes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, son of David, do you run the Jewish RCIA program?" He said, "I want to be baptized." He said, "You can't." He said, "You've skipped about 700 years of training." Okay. But then the woman, back to you, and the woman says, Sorry, ma'am. Obviously, I misaddressed you. You're not only the RCIA leader. Are you also a universal instrument for salvation for all people?" You'd have to say, "Yes, then I'm one of yours." Okay. Now, I'm not sure you'd baptize her or whatever. That's not the point. It's not so much how programmatic or non-programmatic it should be. Notice Jesus has two identities. He is the Son of David. He's the Jewish Messiah, and underneath that rubric, he can do certain things, and he can't do others. But he's also Adonai. He is the universal instrument of salvation for all people, okay? And under that rubric, he can do other things. Now, that isn't just true about Jesus. That's true of the Roman Catholic Church. That's true of each of you in this room. The Roman Catholic Church is the Son of David, and it's Adonai. Each of you as a minister and a person, you are the son of David or the daughter of David, and you are Adonai. And that's a great tension, and it's meant to be a tension. It was a tension in Jesus' life. It was a huge tension for the early church, and it's meant to be a tension, So in one sense, you're this loyal son or daughter of the Catholic Church. At the same time, you're a lot more than that. I had the good fortune of working the first, basically 15 years of my ministry in the Archdiocese of Edmonton under Bishop Joseph McNeil. And Joseph McNeil, he taught that to us both theoretically and pastorally. You'd go to him with a pastoral problem, or I'd phone him, I'd say, "What should I do?" He says, "Don't ask me, Father." And he'd say, "You know the mind of the church. You know my mind. You know canon law. And you know what ideally should be done. But you're also looking at these people's pain. And God put you there. You decide. Tell me afterwards." Okay? Now, see, and you don't decide. The reason I bring this up because that's the archetypal tension between liberals and conservatives in the church. Conservatives basically protect the Son of David, and liberals basically protect Adonai. And they're both right, okay? And they don't like each other. Okay. And it's a great tension. And it's not a tension that's meant to be, that's the whole problem. It shouldn't be resolved ideologically. If I'm liberal, I always do it one way. If I'm conservative, I always do it the other way. I like the way Joseph McNeil said. He says, "You know the mind of the church. You know canon law. You know what ideally should be done. And you're also looking at these people with their problems and so on." And he says, "Bring them together. God put you there." Okay. But see, I bring this up because that is really the archetypal tension between liberals and conservatives when you parse it out. And they both protect something. There's something really valuable, but it's inside of you. You're always, okay, you're a Roman Catholic. You know canon law, and maybe we don't know it, but that's not the point. So you can phone a canon lawyer. There's lots of them in Ottawa. Okay. And and at the same time, you are a universal instrument of salvation. And that's a tension in the church today. Secondly, I'll tell you a little story on this, kind of humorous, but true story. When Tony Blair was Prime Minister in England, and yes, he was an Anglican. His wife was Roman Catholic, his kids, and he'd always go to Catholic church, and they'd go to communion. In fact, John Paul twice gave Tony Blair communion. Well, they had changed pastors in his parish in Westminster, and the new pastor wasn't so sure about that. So he phoned one of the auxiliary bishops in London. He says, I have Tony Blair coming here, high profile, prime minister, going to confess him. What do I do, Well, the bishop gave him good advice. He said, no, that's a pastoral issue, and you're the pastor. Okay. He said, so I want you to pray about that, and then you tell me afterwards what you want to do. So a week later, the bishop phoned and said, how did you resolve this? The priest said, well, I went to church. I knelt down, I prayed, said, what would Jesus do? And the bishop said, God, you didn't. Okay. Okay. No, but that's a tricky question. What would Jesus do? You notice when you look at what Jesus did, notice in this, he starts one way, finishes another way, sometimes goes the other way. Jesus was very, very complex, and Jesus didn't act pastorally according to ideological lines. He acted pastorally. Okay. Secondly, the tension between the kenotic and the triumphant Christ. Again, these are ways for me to try to explain some of the archetypal tensions that exist in the church. We usually say a liberal, a conservative, but they're deeper than that. There's deeper. Incidentally, Thomas Aquinas once defined the soul. So Thomas Aquinas said, how do you understand the soul? Well, you can't picture a soul. So Thomas Aquinas says, in a soul, there are two principles. There's a principle of energy and fire. And there's a principle of integration and glue. And those principles are intention. And it's, that's not abstract at all. If you've ever been in a room and watched somebody die, you know the exact time the soul leaves the body. Not because you see something floating up to heaven, but at 1 minute there's tension in the body, and they're on morphine and so on. The next minute, it's completely inert. 1 minute, that body is still an organism working together. The next minute, it's a bunch of chemicals decomposing. See, so your soul holds things together, and your soul keeps you on fire. And those two principles are in tension with each other. When Jesus says, what does it profit you if you gain the whole world and suffer the loss of your own soul? He wasn't primarily saying this. What if you are rich and successful and happy and whatever, and you die and go to hell? He said, you can suffer the loss of your soul. How do you lose soul? You can lose soul in two ways. You can lose soul by dissipation, and you can lose soul by petrification. I can lie in bed sometime and I'm so angry. I'm angry at the world. I hate everybody and so on. I'm losing my soul. My energy is going down. Or I can be something. I don't know who I am anymore. And the world's changing and so on. See, you can dissipate that you don't know who you are. You can petrify so you become an angry person. Notice that's perfectly illustrated in the two sons of the prodigal father. The one initially loses himself to dissipation. The older son loses himself. He can't go into the house. The house is God. That's heaven. It's the Father's house. He can't go. He's done everything right, but he's so angry. He can't do it. Both have lost his soul. But again, that's the liberal and conservative principle. Liberals protect the fire and conservatives protect the glue. And they're both very important. Now, the kenotic and the triumphal Christ. Begin with two stories. When I was still living in Rome, on our general council, and in fact we did this seminar here at St. Paul's University, but we did a series of seminars we called Being Missionaries to Our Own Children. And so we tried to get together people we call best practice. So we did the very first one at St. Paul's here in Ottawa. And one of the women we had speaking was, some of you may know her, Vivienne Labrie, who's a social worker in Quebec City, And anyway, she began by saying, I'm not a theologian, apologize for that, and so on. But she said this. She says, I work for Jesus. And I work on the streets. I work with the poor. She said, and I work for Jesus, but I can go for 3 years and not even mention his name on the streets. She said, because I'm convinced that God is mature enough that he doesn't need to be the center of our conscious attention all the time. It's quite a statement. She said, I think God is mature enough. God doesn't need to be the center of our conscious attention. Okay. Second story. About 2 months later, I was our general chapter in Rome, the Oblates. And we're in 70 countries, so when we get together for a chapter, it's like a little United Nations, okay? And so the last week, we spent trying to write a document, and we start from scratch. No instrumentum laboris. We spend 2 days, it's just people put out ideas. So they say, okay, let's write a document. So our provincial from Ireland stands up, and he says this. So, I live in Ireland, in Dublin, he said, which is the center right now of the epicenter of the sexual abuse crisis. He said, so I keep my head down. He said, where it belongs. He says, as a Catholic priest or Catholic presence in Ireland, he said, the only Christ I can preach right now is the kenotic Christ. The Christ, who empties himself, the Philippians hymn. Though he's in the form of God, Jesus didn't deem equality with God something to be grasped at. He emptied himself, took the form of a slave, and then emptied himself further. Okay, he said, I can only preach the kenotic Christ. He hadn't sat down, and 5 people had microphones and were objecting. They're saying, no, no, and no. That's just the worst posture you can have. They said, what we need today in an age of secularity, we need to be out there. They said, look at John Paul and World Youth Days and so on, the success of that. Look at the power of that. Some people even quoted Karl Barth, And Karl Barth had some interesting things to say. Karl Barth says, Christians, we're way too apologetic. He said, we're trying to sell Jesus like a soap. If you might need him. He said, Christ is to be proclaimed. Christ is going to judge the world. Why the hell are we apologizing for him? And so on. Tell people, get your ship in order. This is the man who's going to judge you. He said, no, we need to be out there. We need to be out there. Visual, so on. Well, who's right? They're both right. Again, they're both right. There are 2 Christs, in Scripture and in Christian Catholic tradition. There is the kenotic Christ, the Christ who disappears, and that's part of the Christ of our baptism. And there's the visible, triumphant Christ of Corpus Christi processions and World Youth Days and so on. And they're both important, But again, liberals protect one and conservatives protect the other. Now this may be an oversimplistic statement, but it works as an oversimplification. In many ways, that's the tension between the Vatican II generation and the John Paul II generation. See, the Vatican II generation came out of the Vatican very much to move into kenosis, to move into a non-triumphalistic stance and so on, and to move beyond, reduce the visible symbols. That's why nuns took off the habit and so on. We're going to immerse ourselves into the ordinary. The John Paul II generation says the opposite. We need, again, to show the visible symbols together. And it gets right out to how we dress. If I put on a collar, I'm triumphal. If I take it off, I'm kenotic. So I try to get something in between. Okay. No, there is no right or wrong to this. But the important thing I'm going to say later, especially after, we have to stop the tension inside. One of the biggest things working against evangelization and catechesis is our own internal tensions. We are basically too much neutralizing each other inside. We have to become one team, and that team needs both. That team needs liberals, that team needs conservatives, and so on. And then lastly, a powerful tension between evangelization, catechesis, and theology. I'll talk about that, There's 3 things here. Evangelization is one thing. Catechesis is still another thing, and theology is still a third thing. And too often, one or the other becomes imperialistic, But I'll talk about that later. Okay. If you can, next slide. So consequently, I'm just going to name these here. First of all, we need a new apologetics to respond to secularity with a new that should be socially imaginary. Term stolen from Charles Taylor. We need a new socially imaginary. I'll talk about that. We need, the old apologetics. Let me give you an example. And I liked it. When I was a young seminarian, and we were studying Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc and some really good, and then we'd have, they were great apologists, Nobody's ever undone Chesterton, But the apologetic was kind of start this way. Imagine you're a Catholic. How do you convince the non-Catholic about Catholic Church. Or you imagine you're a Christian, how do you convince an atheist, and it was oftentimes you're on a bus and you meet this atheist, or what do you do? Well, today we change it this way. You're at your own kitchen table. You're talking to your kids. Okay. We're a long ways from the atheist on a bus. It's inside of our own families. Okay. Then secondly, we need to be more robust vis-a-vis the missionary dimension of the church. And last night, Josephine talked about that, the missionary dimension of the church. When you go back just a generation, say 50 years, or 70 years perhaps, in Canada, notice every diocese had missionaries. It wasn't just left to religious orders. Missionary was the schools I went to. Remember, we had the Holy Childhood. We were baptizing babies in other countries and so on. We were sending missionaries around the world. Okay, see, we had a missionary sense. We've almost lost that, and especially we've lost it internally. So I'll give you an example. I was talking with our own bishop, not the current one, the former one. One day he was saying, God, he said, I wish you'd write differently. He said, I hate your writings. He said, you're always talking metaphor and you're on edges. He said, why don't you just give people hard doctrine and catechesis, because that's what they need. He's right. But I answered this way. I said, why I write the way I do? Because I'm a missionary. I said, I went to World Youth Days in Toronto, and I loved it. There were 1 million kids there in colorful spandex telling the Pope they loved him, and he told them they loved him and so on. It was wonderful. And the bishops were there catechizing the kids and so on. That was wonderful. It was needed. But as a missionary, I was also conscious that there were 50 million kids not there. And we got to go to the 1 million kids who were there. We got to go to the 50 million who weren't there. See, today, it's interesting. If you look at ecclesiology, the last 50 years since the council, we have made wonderful strides in terms of renewal inside. We have better liturgies, we have better preaching, we have better catechetical programs, we have better diocesan programs, we have conferences like this and so on. That, inside we do really well. The trouble is we can't get people to come inside. We know what to do with somebody who walks through a church door. We no longer know how to get people to walk through the church door. So that we don't have so much of a maintenance issue, we have a missionary issue. Okay. And then lastly, we need to understand more clearly the relationship between evangelization, theology, catechesis. I'll talk about that. And then we need to move beyond our own internal divisions. Okay. Next slide. What I want to give you in the last time I have left, I just want to give you some metaphors. I call them metaphors to digest. Now, these metaphors, you can see these images don't agree with each other. Sometimes they contradict each other and so on, but all of them are rich and each of them grabs something, okay? And then you can discuss at your tables or just take them home. Because, when you read ecclesial literature and stuff today, you just get a lot of different perspectives. So I want to give you I call them metaphors just to digest. The first one, I call Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, and I say Cardinal Ratzinger here rather than Pope Benedict, because he didn't say that anymore after he became Pope. This was the pre-Pope Ratzinger. Okay. But when Joseph Ratzinger or Benedict was in charge of the Holy Office, he would often put out this expression, we live in a post-Christian West. Okay. Particularly, he said Western Europe, where he came from, said Western Europe is post-Christian. Okay. I'll just hang that out there. Is it? You can make a lot of strong arguments. I'll give you just one problematic argument. If you take, for instance, the most secular part of our whole world, which is not North America, although Canada is way ahead of the United States in terms of secularity. I live in the United States. The United States is really religious. Of all the developed nations, it's far and away the most religious, I live in San Antonio. You can go into Walgreens, which is like Shoppers Drug Market. You can buy a rosary in there. I don't think you're going to find them in Shoppers Drug Market in Canada. Okay. But take the Scandinavian countries, Holland, the Netherlands, and so on. That's the most advanced, most secularized parts of the world. So you can look at them religiously and say they're post-Christian. Hardly anybody goes to church. Everything's legal. Abortion, euthanasia, divorce, pornography, drugs, and prostitution, you name it. Well, that's a cesspool of non-value. On the other hand, those countries take care of their poor better than anybody in the whole world. That's a massive Christian achievement. I live where the religious right is really strong. Many of them couldn't find the poor with a GPS, but they're into Jesus. Okay. And it's not that they're wrong and Holland's right or whatever. No, it's just, it's complicated. Is it post-Christian? Then, the second one. I love this one. Pierre de Chardin. He said, you look at Christianity, he says, we're still in diapers. He says, God, we're only 2,000 years old. You're talking about millions of years of history. He said, keep this in perspective. He said, we're still a church in diapers. No, we haven't even graduated from that yet. I want to give you one of his great statements on hope. He was giving a talk one day, and he was talking about how, science, the way they see the world, and religion, it's all going to come together in this headship in Christ and so on. And someone said, well, suppose we blow up the world with an atomic bomb. What happens to your little schema then? Teilhard said, well, that would be a 2 million year setback. Okay. Okay. He said it would be a setback. He said, it's going to happen. He said, not because I wish it. He said, because Christ promised it. And in the resurrection, God showed that God has power to deliver on the promise. He said, if you believe that, we're in good shape. Julian of Norwich says, the end of our story is already written. All will be well, and all will be well, and every manner of being will be well. That's already assured. So don't get anxiety down here. To which Oscar Wilde added a great line. She said, all will be well, and all will be well. And Oscar Wilde said, and if it isn't well, it's still not the end. It's a great Easter homily. Okay. Okay. Then Sigmund Freud. I just pulled him out, but just the Enlightenment in general. They gave this expression, faith is a spent project. Faith is simply a spent project. It had its time, while the world was enchanted and we needed superstition and so on, but it's finished, Even the story. Tom Groom tells the story of his own life. Tom Groom said he grew up in rural Ireland, when he said before we had telephones in rural area and so on. And he said, my father was away on a trip, and he said he was the youngest of 9 children, and he said he got pneumonia, okay? And one night his fever just spiked, and his mother couldn't do anything. She couldn't phone anybody. There's nobody to phone. She didn't have a car. She couldn't take him to a hospital. So what she did, she said, she knelt down by my bed. She pinned a medal of Therese of Lisieux on my pajamas and said, now we're both going to pray until this fever stops. So we prayed, and he said, we're saying the rosary, and finally they both fell asleep. When he woke up, the fever was gone. Now, he said his mother claimed it was a miracle till the day she died. Tom said, it's not, of course, a miracle. It's this. He said, today, he said, my nephews and nieces and so on, they wouldn't even think of doing that. It wouldn't be on their radar screen. First of all, because it wouldn't have to be on their radar screen. They would have cell phones and ambulances and so on. The last thing you'd ever do is pin a medal to somebody's pajamas and start praying. See, we're just in a whole different situation, called secularity. Okay. See, and so people like Freud says, God isn't needed in that, and God has just disappeared. Okay. Interestingly, when I gave you the statistic about nuns, that people don't, the majority of them are between 18 and 40. You know what that tells you? It's significant. Those are the ages where we feel immortal. Remember, you don't need God. You're young, you're healthy, your heart hasn't been broken, your health hasn't been broken, and so on. You can walk on water and say, I don't need God. Okay. Then faith is a spent project. Then Thomas Halleck, you know who he is? He's a Czech writer, priest, had been an underground priest in Czechoslovakia, who recently won the Templeton Award for spirituality, which is like winning the Nobel Prize in spirituality. That's been won by Charles Taylor, by Jean Vanier, and so on. But Halleck says, what we're suffering in the West, he said, we're suffering from a certain noonday fatigue. We're going through a period of acedia in the Western thing. See, it's not, faith isn't dying, That's what the Desert Fathers called acedia. We're suffering a noonday fatigue. Or his second image, he says secular humanism and Christianity are facing off today like the younger brother and the older brother in the parable of the prodigal father. He says, that what's inside the church in many ways represents the older brother, and secular society in many ways represents the younger son, and so on. Incidentally, bad line, but I got it from a bishop, so I'm going to use it here, okay? But he said, whenever you're preaching on this, he said, just see if your audience is awake, So he said, he always says, the younger son, he took his father's inheritance, he went off to a distant land where he squandered half the money on prostitutes and drinking. He said, then he wasted the other half. Okay. Okay. A little slow. Okay, it's an image. Okay. Then, Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor is this marvelous Canadian in Montreal. Who today, I don't think anybody in the academic world has the respect that he has, And he's a Roman Catholic, very practicing Roman Catholic, but his book, A Secular Age, and just his writing on secularity have kind of become the canon. That's the way you analyze secularity. But he analyzes it, and he has a positive conclusion. He said, you can remain a very pious practicing Christian after this. But he says, we have a crisis. We don't have a crisis of faith, we have a crisis of imagination. We have a crisis of imagination. He said the conditions of belief have changed. Just the story I just told you with Tom Groom, He said, we came from a time, if you back a couple of hundred years before the Enlightenment, where it was almost impossible to not believe, to a situation where belief is one option among many options, and oftentimes not the primary option. Okay. But he says, it's not a crisis of faith. He says, it's a crisis we need a whole new imagination. I mean, to use an image, we're like pioneers. When the pioneers came to open up Canada, actually they knew what they were doing because they had been farmers in Europe. But, today you're raising kids and so on. Nobody has ever been in this situation before. Nobody has ever had to deal with this kind of affluence, with this kind of media and so on. There's never been a generation ever in the history of the world where everybody had a phone in their hand every minute. We are just in a whole different world. As I want to say this afternoon, God can stand up to that world, but we're going to need some new imaginations, And for instance, how do we deal with the fact of this individuality where the whole parish structure is predicated on something else? It's predicated on being a neighbor. That, neighbors go to a neighborhood place and so on. Today they don't. It's different. He said there's a whole new social imaginary, and that's one of his words he invented. So just like it's an ethos. It's the air you breathe. I'll give you a simple example just of my own life. I grew up in West Central Saskatchewan, immigrant area, where everybody went to church every Sunday. And if you didn't, you were noticed. If Jack didn't go, some of the people questioned, Jack, you weren't at Mass yesterday, and so on. But just, the social ethos, the entire pressure was that you were a practicing Catholic. Okay. With my nephews and nieces, they live in the opposite world. You have to be a deviant to go to church on Sunday. See, we had to be a deviant to not go to church on Sunday. Today, they have to be a deviant to go. Okay. See, and the social imaginary has changed. We need a new one. Then, two of my favorite writers, very different writers, but they come together on this. Kathleen Norris, I'm not sure if you know who she is. She's a marvelous. She's not a Catholic writer, although she's a lay Benedictine and so on. Actually, she has a very interesting history. She was a writer in New York, kind of a lapsed Presbyterian, and living with this artist and so on. But her grandfather was a Presbyterian minister in Lemon, South Dakota, and he died. So she went out for the funeral. She had actually been born in Hawaii with her husband. Both were unemployed at the time, okay? And then they had the funeral for her grandfather, and then the family said, somebody has to stay here to sell the house. So since they had nothing going in their lives, they stayed. But they stayed for the next 35 years till he died, okay? She became a lay Benedictine and wrote some marvelous spiritual books. He was a poet. Eventually he died and so on. And she had an interesting religiosity. She would go to Catholic Mass every day, and on weekends she functioned as a Presbyterian minister and would go to these rural parishes and run their service because they needed me, But she wrote some marvelous books. And her view is this. She says, if you want to understand secular society and the church today, she says, imagine a 17-year-old belligerent teenager standing before her parents, I know more than you do. I know all your faults. It's certain adolescent grandiosity. So she said secularity is our child, but right now it's a belligerent child. It's a child that's full of adolescent grandiosity. See, an adolescent, when they're in this stage, they know all your faults. They know the parents' faults. What they don't know is the parents taught them and gave them everything they have. That's their roots, but they're not seeing this, and now they're in your face. And at your 17, sometimes all parents look better than your parents, And that's why they can try Buddhism and Hinduism and New Age or everything except Catholicism or Christianity, because it's your parents, But what's key there, this is our child. It's not our enemy. You're going to see, pastorally, if you don't get anything else from my two talks, take this back. Secularity is not our enemy, it's our child. When people say about the world and stuff, they're talking about your kids. They're talking about your nephews and nieces. This is not some vague enemy out there. Some conspiracy between, the gays and feminism and Marxism and no. It's your kids they're talking about, okay? And then Louis Dupree, the philosopher at Yale, he just, writing at a different level, but he just adds something to it. He has the same image. Louis Dupree says that we have a generation now of people who, even if they're going to church, oftentimes have attitudes towards the church. A lot of people not going to church. He said, they're like that 17-year-old. He said, except, remember this. He said, a 17-year-old belligerent child, they're not bad, they're just not finished. Notice? He says, secularity isn't bad, it's just a long ways from being finished. It can change the way we pastorally see it. Okay. Then, Richard Rohr. Simple. Richard Rohr said, we're in the belly of the whale. Okay. See, Jonah, we're supposed to be doing some purification, and we're not doing it, and so consequently we're in the dark. We're being moved someplace where we need to be, but we don't want to go. Then, Walter Casper, he has an interesting image. Walter Casper said, what we're struggling with in Western Christianity? He said, he calls it the detached retina syndrome. It's an interesting image. And Casper says, if you were born blind, you wouldn't have images inside of you. You couldn't picture what a tree looks like because you have no image. But imagine you were born and you could see, and then at a certain point you go blind. All the images are inside of you. You can't see them anymore, but you know them all inside of you. And he says, that's what's happened in Western Christianity. He says, we've inhaled all the images, the symbolism, the ethos, but we're not seeing it ourselves anymore. And so he said, with each generation, the danger is this is going to get weaker. Okay. And then a very reviewed book 2 years ago from Rod Dreher called The Benedict Option. Any of you read The Benedict Option? But I think he's a journalist for the New York Times, but he wrote this book, and he really believes that secularity has gone too far, that we're not going to be able to leaven mainstream society anymore. So what we have to do is we have to regroup like the early Christians. We have to go into kind of monastic mode, which means homeschooling your kids, pulling away, kind of creating domestic monasteries and other monasteries, and preserving the literature and what's good, and then eventually the world comes to us, It's a very reviewed book, The Benedict Option. Then I just want to leave you with a couple of salient biblical images. It's interesting. Biblical images, one or two words speak a whole volume. Okay. Priest friend of mine, he says, he had some study group together, and he says, give an image that to your mind describes the world and the church today. One woman said, Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay. Now, you don't have to agree with her, but notice in 3 words, she's speaking a whole volume. She doesn't say, well, we're in a post-Christian age of moral relativity and all this stuff. Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay. Well, I'm not going to land with Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm going to propose 3 images to you. One of them is the image of the desert. You know, the desert was the time they came out of Egypt with tambourines banging. You know, you're going to read that in the Holy Saturday liturgy. Then Miriam, the women, brought out the tambourines. They sang songs of freedom with the naive expectation that in a week they're going to be in the promised land. It didn't work like that. It took 40 years. We came out of Vatican II 60 years ago, tambourines banging. 60 years later, we're still in the desert. We're still going round and round and round. You know, it's interesting with that image, if you just unpackage the desert. The Sinai Desert is not that big. So how do you spend 40 years wandering around in there, Okay. Well, it means they would come back to the same spot a lot of times. I'm sure you've experienced that. If you've been working in Catholic circles for the last 40 years, every once in a while you have a conference like this, say, didn't we have this conference 20 years ago? Back on the same spot, the desert. Then the exile. See, the exile is actually a deeper image than the desert. It's a profound biblical image of dark night. See, it's interesting. And the exile happens at the high point of Israel's history. David and Solomon have united the kingdoms. They've conquered the enemies. They've built a great temple in Jerusalem. And they have all the people united. And just at the high point of Israel's history, the Assyrians come. They conquer the land. They kill the king, they deport all the people, and they knock the temple down to its last stone. So now the people are in Babylon, in exile, and this is a deep faith crisis. They said, what? God promised us a land, a king, a temple. We had it, and now it's gone. And the answer God gives in Deuteronomy? He says, you'll find me again when you search for me in a deeper way, when you search for me with your whole heart, mind, and soul. See, we can look back now and say, well, they had the wrong idea. The land wasn't Palestine. The king wasn't Solomon. And, the temple wasn't Jerusalem. We're talking about heaven and God and Christ and so on. But they had to learn that. They had to be purified from that. And it was a heck of a purifying experience for them to realize the land isn't some geographical land. Today, that's true for us. Many of us grew up in a church that we had land, king, and temple. Today, we're not so sure where we're standing, and so on. And that's also where you get the laments of Babylon. It's interesting. Notice the laments of Babylon. They said, how can we be happy? Because someone has stolen our land, our king, and our temple. So it's a lament. Henry Nouwen was the first person to point that out to me. He says, he said today, in both liberal and conservative circles, there isn't a lot of joy. There's just a lot of lamenting. These terrible conservatives, these terrible liberals, and so on. That's the lament of Babylon. The next time you see that psalm in Scripture, by the rivers of Babylon, there we hung up our harps. You know what they're talking about. That sometimes the most angry, morose people you see in clerical circles, or church circles, or religious circles. Notice, we don't have a monopoly in this. Notice Al-Qaeda, ISIS. These are people who are bitter, murderous, rages in God's name. We're going to kill somebody because you're trying to steal our kids and so on. Incidentally, they look on Western culture, Western pop culture like a drug. They say, it has to be stopped. If our kids inhale this drug, they're gone. Then, the road to Emmaus, which is probably my favorite text. I once had a class with Edward Skillebex, and somebody asked him in class, they said, Professor Skillebex, if you had to name one image, just one image from Scripture of where we're at today, what would you name? He didn't hesitate. He said, we're on the road to Emmaus. He said, we are on the road to Emmaus. He said, we're in that time where one Christ has been crucified, the Christ we were raised on, but the Christ that's walking with us, we're still not recognizing that Christ. Christ is never dead. images of Christ and images of church and so on die. Christ doesn't die. The church doesn't die. He said, so a Christ has been crucified. A church has been crucified. But the church and Christ are walking with us, and we have to have new eyes to see it, Incidentally, that text has this is a homiletic dream if you're a preacher, this text, So Luke says, on the morning of the first day, 2 disciples were walking away from Jerusalem towards Emmaus, and they were depressed. Okay, it's interesting. In Luke's gospel, Jerusalem means the church. It means their faith dream. It means the place of humiliation. And notice they're walking away from it. They're leaving the church. And they're walking towards Emmaus. Now, there were 3 different Emmauses, but they suspect this was the one they were walking to. It was a Roman spa. They were heading for Las Vegas. Okay. Since the church doesn't work, Christ has been crucified, I'm just heading towards human consolation. And it's interesting, you can't get there. Notice, as a Christian, you can't get to Las Vegas. Jesus is going to get you and cut you off. Notice that very night they're back inside the church, and so on. But see, whenever we're depressed, invariably we're walking towards Emmaus, consciously or unconsciously. I want to move towards something that fulfills me, some kind of, consolation because faith isn't working anyway. And on that road, we meet Jesus. And notice it ends with the Eucharist, where they recognize from the breaking of the bread, and that sent them back into the church. Ronald Knox, the great British theologian, he once says, and I stole the title of my book from him, he said, the Eucharist is our one great act of fidelity. So, as Christians said, we haven't been faithful to Christ, really. We don't turn the other cheek. We don't love our enemies, and all the other on and on. He said, but we've been great in faithful in one great way. He said, we have kept the Eucharist going. And that's going to be enough. It's going to save us. It calls you back and sends you back to Jerusalem and so on every time you're heading for Vegas. Then finally, the last one, waiting in the upper room. The 3 synoptic gospels end with the ascension, where Jesus goes out on the Mount of the Ascension and he gives the disciples a last instruction, then he ascends to heaven, But the gospels write up the tonality of that very differently. So, for instance, in Matthew's gospel, it's a triumphant Christ. So it's a strong church. You get a sense this was a strong community. He says, now, the last instruction, go out and convert the whole world and baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's quite a mandate, okay? But it must have been a very confident church. Luke's gospel doesn't end like that. In Luke's gospel, the ascending Jesus says, go back into the city, Jerusalem, the church, and stay there. Stay there until you feel yourself clothed with new power from on high. So Luke's gospel ends with them going back into the city, into the upper room, and they have to wait for something else to happen, okay? And then that's the end of Luke's gospel, but Luke wrote Acts of the Apostles. Luke 2 begins with them in the upper room, and the Holy Spirit appears to them. And then they come out of the upper room, and now they can take on the whole world. Now they speak all the languages, the tongues, they're ready. But notice that phase into the upper room and wait. Okay. That's a bit of an image of where we are sometimes in the church. We're in the upper room. It's frustrating, but it's a good place to be. I want to give you a great line from Peter Murren. Peter Murren was with Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker. Peter Murren used to say this, and all of you work in church circles, this is the one line you need. Okay. Peter Murren says, whenever you don't know what else to do, just keep going to these church meetings. He said, because Pentecost happened at a church meeting. It's really true. Pentecost didn't happen to a solitary praying on a mountain. It didn't happen to Buddha under a tree, It didn't happen to Jesus in the desert. It happened to a group of Christians in a room like this, at a church meeting. He said, whenever you don't know what to do, keep going to church meetings, because Pentecost happened at one of those. So it's sometimes when we get discouraged and so on. And we look at these images. I'm going to end with one last image, which comes from Christina Crawford. Christina Crawford is Joan Crawford's daughter. She wrote that book, Mummy Dearest, But But she wrote another book afterwards called Survivor. And it traces her exit out of Hollywood. Actually, she became a Roman Catholic through the RCIA, But this book, Survivor, traces her own journey through depression into religion and so on. But at one point she says, I reached a point in my life, she says, where I was completely and hopelessly lost. She said, I was simply a lost soul. Then she says this, but lost is a place too. But lost is a place too. See, the upper room, the desert, the exile, they're a place too, See, so it's not, we don't have to always say, are we good or are we bad? Are we going to hell in a bucket? Are we making progress? And so on. No. Where we're at, it's a place too, It's not the place my parents' generation was at. It's not the place I was at as an altar boy in the 1950s. It's not the place where we might be in 10 years from now. It's the place where we're at right now, Lost is a place too, The struggles we have with our kids and with, graying churches and so on, that's a place too. That's where we're at, Now, I've given you these metaphors to, which I don't think I moved to. Did I move to? No. Give them the one last slide so they see what should have been seen. Okay. I can't see what is on there, but anyway. Okay. Okay, anyway, I'm going to end on this for this morning. We have about 10 or 15 minutes left. What I want you to do is just do some table talk now. And ask yourself this question. I learned this from the anthropologist Michael Mead. He says, whenever a group discussion, don't say, well, what was important or something. Just say, what single thing struck you, irritated you, struck you, or whatever. He said, because that's your entry into the substance. Don't say, what was important. No. Of everything I said this morning, what single thing caught you? Maybe just even irritated you or said something to you, and then ask yourself, why? Why? Because that's the entry into the thing. So take about 15 minutes now, just in table talk. What single thing struck you from what I said? And then at the end, we'll have about 5 minutes to have a little bit of reaction. Okay.